All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Denise Matthews, and I do see a lot of familiar names on there. So some of you may know me or be familiar with what I have done. Some people may not. I'll tell a little bit more about myself. I did work at Peak for 5 years or so, and now I'm starting my own farm and nature school at my own property in White Rock. We're out in the Pajarito Acres area, and it's called Worms and Wildflowers Farm and Nature School. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about what I have found to be successful with starting a garden from scratch. There wasn't anything there. And so I have created different gardening spaces and done a lot of planting. And so I'm just here to share what I have found to be successful, and hopefully will be helpful for you guys as well. Just to get started, as many of you probably know, we're in zone 6, Los Alamos and White Rock are. And so that means a few things for how we, for how we plant. So we are getting very close to our last frost date, which is generally thought of to be around Mother's Day. It's been kind of a warm year, but if any of you guys may have noticed, we did get really cold temperatures last night. Got down to the 30s or like 30, 29 in White Rock. But we should be getting out of that in the next couple days or so. And then we have until October, usually mid-October is when we can count on before we get another frost. So we have those 22 weeks, and that it was really a nice chunk of time, but there are things we can do to get started earlier in the spring, just because May can be a little late compared to other places. And so we do want to take like full use of the spring and summer to make the most out of our yards and gardens. So I'll tell a little bit more how I do that. I'm going to structure the talk tonight in terms of a timeline from when I get started until, and like what kinds of things you can be doing through early spring and then into May, when you actually can plant outside. And well, I'll be thinking about like garden supplies, like what do you need to get, soil preparation, how can we make sure our soil's ready, how are we watering, and what are we going to plant. And hopefully those are all things you guys have been thinking about and have questions about. And definitely please ask me anything that may seem relevant to you and your situation. I'm just trying to be as helpful as I can. So for this timeline is a lot of information. And so I put it there because I'm going to make this slideshow available and sent out in an email after the presentation's over, because it has a lot of information in it if you want to look back at it. But I'll go through each month separately so that we can dive a little deeper into some of these topics. So starting in February, I have what I find to be most useful for me, kind of the system that I use. I do highly recommend having a greenhouse in this climate. A greenhouse helps so much with getting plants started, unless you're planting like very small scale and you can do it in your house, and that works too. But it does help extend your season a lot, because you can start things inside in your greenhouse way sooner than you would be able to plant outside. And that means that you can plant things like tomatoes and peppers from seed instead of having to buy all the starts, which if your garden is big enough can get really expensive. So here I have, setting up the greenhouse and ordering seed pots and ordering seeds. I do like the seed pot system, and people use all sorts of different systems and the other things I'm sure work for different people. But I will say that I like these because they're really easy. You can hydrate them. You just get them dry and then you hydrate them and they kind of plump up. And I have really good germination rates with them, and that's why I like to use them. They all kind of fit nicely on a tray, and then you can put them on your heat mats. And the heat mats are also really important in a greenhouse. If you're out in February, it's not going to be warm enough in the winter. So you do have to have those heat mats to keep the soil temperatures high. And then ordering seeds, of course, and I put January there because I'm sure many of you know that if you wait until March or April or May to get seeds, a lot of places are sold out. And so you want to be thinking about that way back in January. I will say, I will say this timeline is just an ideal timeline. It's not like, oh, I didn't order seeds yet, so I can't order them now. It's not true at all. I mean, you can start anywhere you're at. This is just kind of an ideal idea of what you can do, and maybe try for next year if you're not having success with a certain thing. So yeah, ordering seeds early, and then allowing for over the fall and winter, allowing that manure and compost to age so that you have nice compost and nice manure to mix into your soil. Making sure to water your trees and large shrubs in the winter about once a month by hand. That will help them a lot in the spring, come back to life and be ready to grow. And then, yeah, growing things inside. I do have a list also here of places that I like to buy seeds from. And that's because a lot of them are either native here or have been developed for high desert climate. And so the plants do tend to grow better and they have better varieties. So it does make a difference than if you're just buying like seeds that you see at Metzger's or Smith's or something. You definitely will see a difference in how they grow and the success. Okay, so February, it's still early and you're not doing a lot in the garden yet. And you're just getting things kind of set up and making sure you have an idea. March is when things really get going and you really want to be thinking about all those designs. And I imagine many of you have been doing that and are kind of on your way. But this is just kind of an idea of what's good to think about. So you have your garden design, and I think that's really important. A lot of people tell me, or like, I put all this work into my garden and things were going so well, and then the gophers ate everything, or the squirrels ate everything, and so that can be so frustrating and definitely can cost a lot of money. So it's really important to think about that system before you plant so that you're not so frustrated by your garden later on in the summer. And so I'll show some pictures of what I've done for some critter control, and then, building trellises and things that you can do outside before planting really gets going. And then considering your soil, like where's your soil at? Do you think your soil's depleted? Do you think, what will you be adding to your soil, and where are you going to get those materials? And so it's a great time to reach out to, the stables or someone in Pajarito Acres who has horses and try and get horse manure. That's like a great free fertilizer, and you can get a lot of it. So you get a whole truckload and pour it onto your garden. A lot of times people have horse manure piles that have been like sitting all winter. So they've been composting for you pretty much. And it's all old aged horse manure that you can just take and put in your garden, and it's amazing and free. So it's definitely important. I'll talk more about why manure is so great. And then just thinking about, like your wood chips or weed barriers, because things can just get so out of control in the summer, and it can be overwhelming. Where I go to get actual like composted soil, like really nice for planting, is Reunity Resources in Santa Fe. And hopefully a lot of you know of that place. It's awesome. And they actually compost from like all over the city. They collect compost from different businesses, and they have a little farm there and a farm stand, and it's a great place. So I get my soil from there, and I use straw as a mulch, which is really great for veggie gardens. People ask about using the mulch from the eco station. And I do use the mulch from the eco station, but only on perennials. It's like very woody. They chop up a bunch of wood, like old wood scraps that people bring in. And so it's not exactly ideal for mixing into your garden soil. So if you're doing annuals like veggies are, and then you're mixing that in then your soil can just start to get really woody, which makes it low in nitrogen. So you don't necessarily want that, but I definitely use it on things like berries and fruit trees and stuff like that. So then you can continue also planting things inside. You're getting closer to that frost date. So you can start some other things that maybe take not quite as long as peppers and tomatoes, like celery and herbs and flowers and onions and broccoli, because some things can be planted before your frost date, like onions and kale and things like that. So yeah, you're kind of just setting yourself up. Now I'll go through some more pictures, some more things about soil at this point before we get into April. So we actually have, some people ask me, what do you use to make sure the deer aren't getting in, to make sure those animals aren't getting in? So we do have a 6-foot fence around our whole property, and then we top that with an electric fence band. And the electric fence band is really not, the shock is not very strong at all, but I think just the band being there really deters the deer, because they're not jumping that fence. We don't have deer in our yard. We also have dogs, and that might deter them also. We had problems with bunnies getting in, even though we had all that. So we put that 1/4-inch mesh around the whole bottom 3 feet. And that stopped the bunnies. They don't get in anymore at all. So that's been really great. You can also do the motion activated sprinklers for things that can get in, like birds and things. If they're really doing a lot, that then squirrels, especially, that if they walk by and make it go off, it'll spray them with water. And so that can work well too. And then also lining your beds for gophers. We're lucky to not have gophers in our garden, but I did line mine with a chicken wire just to make sure. Okay, now we're going to get into kind of what I like to think, what my favorite part of gardening and is that like recycling aspect of it, of thinking about how efficient your system is in your yard and how you're using your nutrients. It's like a huge concept, and it can be thought of in a lot of different ways. And really it leans more towards the concept of permaculture, if anybody is familiar with that. And we'll get into that a little bit at the end, but it's really just the idea of, how do nutrients get in and how do nutrients get out? What are you doing with your scraps? How are you composting things? How are you working that into your soil and turning that into food? And that's what gardening really is. So for that, we can get back to that topic about manure and why manure is the most wonderful thing ever. So it is a slow release fertilizer, so it'll mix in and fertilize over a long time. It's free usually, unless you're buying it in bags. And more importantly, it improves soil structure and soil aeration and increases your microorganism activity. And those are all really, really important things for plants to be able to grow, especially in our soils that are very clay and have no, not a lot of soil life going on in them, and are very dense, and water doesn't go through very easily, and all those things. So if you're mixing in manure, it's going to help with all of that, all of those issues. And when you're thinking about the different manures you can use, a lot of people are having chickens in their backyard, and actually chicken manure is the best manure to use. It has the highest amount of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. And as we all know, that's your NPK, which is those important main nutrients that your plants need. So by mixing in chicken manure, you're giving them that. Chicken manure is a little higher in nitrogen and can be a little hot, and you don't want to just put chicken manure right on top of a fresh growing plant, because it can kind of burn it, they say. But if it's broken down, then it's great to mix in. And horse manure is also great, and horse manure you can use in much bigger quantities, so it can really help with soil structure. So I do both at ours. I use horse manure to improve the soil structure quite a bit and really bulk up the soil. And then I'll put chicken manure, like composted chicken manure on the top layer. You can also do like small scale composting with like a small tumbler, depending on if you just have like a small couple of raised beds, or you can do a larger size for all your like compost scraps from your house where you're doing a 3-tier system and you have those big bins where you start one on, you start like the greens. You can do it a couple ways. You can do greens and browns and then mix those together, or you can mix it all together in one bin and then move it along as it starts to decompose. The most important thing to remember, I think, with the compost pile here is that you need to water it. If you don't water it, it gets all dried out, the soil, those microorganisms will not survive. And so you won't have any composting happening. And I think that can be a common problem. Our air is so dry here and there's not water. And so it's not just going to compost if you just pile it all. You really have to keep in that moisture. So people do things like put like an old carpet square on top of it, or some kind of mat to hold it after you water it, to hold in that moisture. So I'll talk more about NPK as we go on too, because those are things that you want to think about. If you're having problems with your plants growing, it may be because your soil is deficient in one of those things. So you have your nitrogen. I like this graphic because it just kind of lets you think about what those do. Your nitrogen really helping things be green and grow and be like vigorous. Phosphorus reaching down to the roots and helping make blooms. And then potassium just helping it be like a strong plant all around. Let's see. So this is just an example that I can use. Ideally, later on, I can talk about like an ideal bed and how I made that, but sometimes things aren't ideal and you can't make it exactly like you want it. And so here I have a bed that was kind of an afterthought because I planted fruit trees along the fence and I put irrigation into those fruit trees. And then I decided, well, I have all this extra space back here and I want to make that a bed also. So I can plant all these things between the trees and the fence. But I could not remove that soil because generally I would remove the soil and add in all these nice other manures and composts and all that. And so what I wanted to do, and I couldn't till it up and to mix it in either. And so and it's a large space, but you can still kind of think of it as a raised bed. And what I did was I put cardboard all along the bottom. And then I'm creating a layering compost system on top of it. So I put cardboard, I laid down logs to hold down all that cardboard with all the wind. And then I left those logs there and put horse manure, like huge, like 2 truckloads of horse manure all along the top of it. And that started to decompose all winter. And then I put all the fall leaves that we hadn't raked yet. So I put them in some point in the fall or winter and layered all that. And then I put all my chicken manure on top. And this has all been composting and layering. And then I'm going to put my composted nice soil on the top layer of that. And it's basically a modified version of a hugelkultur bed that I'll talk about later. But it is creating this nice system where there's decomposition happening. There's lots of microorganisms working to break those down. And that's all going to lead to nice nutrient release, which makes nutrients available for plants. And when all those microorganisms and macroorganisms and soil, all that soil biota basically is all working together, then it will create this wonderful system where that will actually turn into really nice soil. And I'll show you more pictures of that as we go. But that's just kind of an example. If you have a space where you're not sure how to do it, and maybe you don't have a rototiller or you can't rototill it, like in this situation, and you can still layer it just like I did. And this is much better than just dumping a whole bunch of soil on there. Because if I were to just go and buy like a bunch of soil, even if I bought it at Reunity Resources, which has really nice compost, it still would be lacking all that microorganism soil life that would build up over that winter with all those other materials. And it also wouldn't have as good of structure. And I'll talk about structure a little bit more, but that allows the plant's roots to grow and have space and have all the microorganisms to have space to live. So you're really creating like this whole environment that will then release nutrients for plants to grow. So that's kind of how I solved that one. And that's a work in progress. I'm still working on that in my yard. Here you can see soil structure. So when I talk about soil structure, I'm talking about having those pores available, having that extra space within the soil, and it having not be like super compressed. If it's super compressed and water can hardly move through, that means roots can hardly move through also. And so your plants are going to be small and have a hard time growing and a hard time getting nutrients. And so that's what I mean when I say soil structure. Ideally, you have about 5% organic matter, and then you have all your other minerals and like carbon, that kind of thing. And then you have water and air space. All right. So getting back into, I put it in the last slide, but getting your soil tested. And I think it's something that people put off and, don't know if it's really worth it. And maybe it may not be worth it to certain people, but I think that it's very like useful information. So if it is something that you want to work on and you're having trouble with your like figuring out if they're missing a nutrient or if something's not growing well, it can be really helpful. I thought it was interesting just to compare our native soil to the garden soil that I created to see what the differences are. And we have your native soil. The native soil here I just did in my backyard with our regular soil. It had an organic matter of 2%, where we had the garden soil that I've created is at 11%. So it's really high in organic matter, which is great. It's maybe even a little higher than it needs to be, but that means that over time, it will break down and still maintain that matter that it needs. I have pretty good infiltration rates, meaning water goes down through the soil quick enough that it's not going to just run off. And when you have that low infiltration rate, water will just run off, then that water's not getting down to the roots where the plants really need it. Okay. If you want to increase your organic matter, I just have a note in here about you really want to, it says adding organic matter is the best way for improving soil. So you're adding like leaves and manure and any like grass clippings and compost and that kind of thing to improve that organic matter. All right, now this is the super detailed soil test that we won't go through everything, but this is the kind of result that you will get. And it was interesting because it told me that, the only things that I really need to do, I don't need to put any fertilizers on my soil. I don't need an NPK fertilizer. I have really high organic matter. The only things I need is iron, and we have a high pH, which is very common here. Everywhere has a high pH around here usually. And so you could, if you were going to plant certain things, put something into your soil that could lower the pH, which can be pretty difficult in a large scale, but you can do it in like smaller areas. And you compare that to the native landscape soil, it's much different. It's low in lots of things. So it's low in organic matter, it's low in nitrogen and phosphorus, and not potassium though. And so we just know that if you're working with native soil, that you're really going to want to add some fertilizers, and that could be in the form of an organic solid fertilizer or a liquid fertilizer. And so these are some options that I like to use as an organic matter type of fertilizer so that I'm not having to buy a whole bunch of synthetic fertilizers. They're expensive for one thing, and they're not always good because they can give you way higher levels than you need. So just mixing in those things like grass clippings and manure into your garden every year, you'll keep your nitrogen levels super high. And bone meal is also something that I like to mix in. And then chicken manure is high in nitrogen and phosphorus. And then potassium is a little more challenging in terms of organic matter stuff. So you can buy a natural fertilizer, but you can also put in like ash. It just has to be done kind of not too much of it. And then if I am going to use an all-around fertilizer, I do like to use the Happy Frog kind, and I do have good success with that. But as you can see it from my soil tests, that I really don't need to add anything. And so if you're doing all these things, if you're putting grass clippings and manure and bone meal and chicken manure, and when you're mixing and leaves and all that, when you're mixing your garden and making your beds, then you won't have to add any extra things. And that saves a lot of money. Okay, you can also plant cover crops. I'll go back. Let's see. This was one thing they said in my soil test. They said, my nitrogen is very high. Excessive nitrogen, may cause bushy plants with small fruits. So I shouldn't add any more nitrogen. And it said, in organic material, it said using a fall planted cover crop can be used as green manure. And that will help mix back into your soil and keep your organic matter high. And so that's when they say that, they mean this. Putting in a cover crop, and cover crops are often nitrogen fixers. So they're taking nitrogen from the air and putting it into the soil so that plants can use it. And so in the winter or like fall, if your bed is done, you can plant something like clover and it will fix nitrogen back into your soil. You can also plant it during your regular garden time, like peas, and they're putting nitrogen back into your soil. And that's why you want to rotate your crops. So if you have peas in one spot or a nitrogen fixing thing in one spot, you might put it in a different spot the next year. And by doing all this and adding all these different organic matters into your soil, what you're doing is creating a home for the organisms that make up the soil food web. And this soil food web is crucial to the release of nutrients into your soil to make them available for plants. Plants can't necessarily access nutrients, but when the fungus and the bacteria and the protozoas are all processing that organic matter, they're changing it to a form that the plants can use. So you want that really healthy soil food web going on in your garden. And this is another really great picture of that soil structure, allowing water to be able to go through, roots to be able to go through, and having the bacteria and the fungus. And some people have a mushroom grow in their garden and they're like, oh, I have mushrooms growing in my garden. Oh no, that's not a bad thing. That means that you have really nice bacteria or fungus colonies that are accessing nutrients and releasing nutrients, and it means you have a healthy soil. Okay, so this is just how important soil structure is, and it's just really a great thing to think about and to make sure that that's your biggest focus in early spring. What kind of environment am I going to put my plant into? I think it's easy to go to a nursery and get excited about plants and buy a bunch of stuff and then not have the soil ready. And you really want to have that nice soil habitat ready so that they have you're putting those plants into a really nice productive place. It'll also make it so that you don't have to use as much water, because that will really maintain your water or in the soil. and then you don't have to water as often, which is huge here, because if you don't have that and don't have mulch, you're going to be watering all the time. All right. So we're getting into April, and this is we're getting warmer, and you can actually start to plant some things outside, especially if you're using frost blankets. So you can plant, like cold weather stuff, kale, potatoes, carrots. You can, let's see, so you can transplant your tomatoes and peppers. You can't plant those outside yet. Your fruit trees are going to be starting to bloom if you have fruit trees. And so you do. So a lot of insects are starting to wake up. And so you want to make sure that you, like bad insects, you want to make sure that you're using prevention methods for that, for any fruit trees that you have, or berries. And so I do have, I put on my organic prevention spray here, and I have it in the slideshow. So this will get sent out in an email after, and you can come back and reference this presentation, and it'll have the recipe for the organic prevention spray. And I use it, and it's awesome. And I haven't had a lot of problems with bugs at all. So it's very important. You do have to use something. If you don't have anything on your fruit trees, they will get all buggy and get like fungus and stuff like that. Here is an example of my irrigation lines. This is another time to start thinking about irrigation, because it's warm enough where you can turn on the water during the day, and you can start fixing any of those leaks that you have. Irrigation is going to have leaks every year, and that's just how it is. And so you do have to work on that, work on fixing them, and kind of and it's really simple and easy, but it does take a little bit of time just to run your lines, find out where something came loose, and reattach it. And it makes your life so much easier for the rest of the summer, because you don't have to be out there watering all day or every day for hours. It just saves so much time if you just put a little bit of time at the beginning. And so this is just a main irrigation line that has the 1/4-inch tubing that can go directly to plants, with 6-inch spacings of holes that'll just drip. And that main big line can hook right to your hose, and your hose spigot, sorry. And so on the spigot, you can also put a timer, and so you can just have it automatically go. And that's really going to be the best way to do that. Here's an example of that. And you can use filters, and you can buy just a whole kit, and it'll have everything that you need. And it's really simple. You just hook it all together. You put your main tube out to where you want the water, and then you have your 1/4-inch tube going off of it. And it uses so much less water than watering by hand with a hose. And it makes it so that you don't have any runoff. You're not like flooding it. It's also less stressful for the plants, because they're getting it at a rate they can use it, instead of being flooded and being overwhelmed, and then having none, and then having it be inconsistent, because a lot of times you're like, oh, I didn't get to water that day. And so they will recognize that they're not getting water consistently, and they will grow slower. So I would highly recommend putting in an irrigation line. Now, this is what I was talking about with a hugelkultur bed. And so I'll get into a little bit about how I make the beds the way that I do, with logs and clippings and all that. And I can show that in my own garden. And I like how this explains it at the bottom. It says, how does it work? So as the wood decays, it retains moisture, releases nutrients, and generates heat. And so it'll also keep it warmer on those cold nights. It absorbs that rainfall really well. It has good infiltration, and it creates that loamy soil that you want. So here's an example. So if you're interested in making new beds, and you can do this as a raised bed above ground also, if you have like raised beds put in. It's just that it actually works better in ground in the Southwest, because it's just so dry here. So raised beds can sometimes, especially if they're not very deep, can just dry out really fast. So in the ground, they're better insulated and will retain that moisture better. But here you have the chicken wire, the logs that are going to hold that and retain that moisture. And then you add manure and straw on top of that. And there's those layers. And then the decomposed compost or topsoil is what people call it a lot, will go on top. And then you can have all your drip lines come in. And it's a really nice idea to put, especially for young seedlings, to use PVC and make these hoops that you can then put shade covers on. And I will also put the frost blankets on them if it's late, like later in the fall or in the early spring. And you can make like a little mini greenhouse in there with it. So, and here's an example of that with the frost blanket. And that is huge. You can have snow go on top of that and it will protect those plants and stay warm in there. They have that nice layer of straw mulch at the bottom and they will be fine. April, your greenhouse is really getting going. Hopefully you have a lot of started that you're going to be transplanting, and you're transplanting your tomatoes to larger pots so that they are continuing to grow bigger. So potting soil, oh, this was something I wanted to mention just because if you're having trouble with transplanting your little tiny seedlings, so you're putting your little tiny seedling into a bigger pot, and once you put it into the bigger pot, it kind of stops growing. It is kind of, it's not dying, but it's not thriving and it's not getting bigger. And what happens is a lot of people use potting soil when they transplant their seedlings. And potting soil, you might have success, but it generally is too dense. And so those little tiny new roots just don't grow well through it. So they get stunted, the plant gets stunted and it doesn't continue to grow. So what you want to make sure is that you're doing is putting it into a seedling mix still. So you have this like a real light mixture. You can make it yourself. And so I have a seedling mix recipe on there. And it's compost and perlite and vermiculite and peat moss, all these real nice light things that hold moisture really well. So that might be something. I was just talking to a friend about it, and so that might be something that people are experiencing. So getting into May, so that's this time of year. So hopefully you'd have your soil ready, you'd have your irrigation lines checked and in. You have straw and all the materials that you need for planting. And so you can, hopefully you've gotten your soil tested, you know if you need to add anything else to it. You, let's see, what else? Yeah, you can just start transplanting. So you can start putting in any of the things that you grew inside. You can also plant outside. So you could go buy things from nurseries at this point and plant them outside or seeds outside. I like to use walls of water for my tomato transplants. They make a huge difference with all the wind in the spring. It really is hard on transplants. And that's why you want to make sure that you're also hardening them off, they say, by putting them outside for about a week before you actually, during the day. So you move them outside during the day and then bring them back in at night and just get them used to being outside, and then they can go into the ground. But yeah, the walls of water will really protect from the wind when it's blowing all around, and it keeps it warm inside there for a little while longer, because tomatoes really do like warm. These are, I think, beans on my little teepee that were probably grown from seed there. And then you can also just start to think about, what are you planting for native flowers and perennials to attract pollinators? My garden is about 3 years old now, and I'm really excited by all the perennials that have been coming up this last month. I'm seeing all sorts of different things coming back, and it makes my planting easier because lots of things are coming back. And it's also a lot of flowers. And so they're attracting the bees and butterflies, and we're getting a beehive coming up on our farm. And so we want to make sure we're planting lots of flowers for them as well. And so we have here things, thinking about what you're planting, what is going to grow well here, what is a native plant, what is going to attract pollinators. And these are all things that were in my garden last year. So I have the dill. I've been planting a lot of milkweed. I've actually been working with Jenna from Peak with her effort to grow more milkweed and give it out. And so I have probably at least 100 starts of milkweed that we're going to be giving out to try and bring awareness to how important milkweed is for monarchs. And then I did have monarchs coming for the Mexican torch sunflower too, which they loved, and will keep its blooms until like late fall. And those are beautiful. The chicory, the bees love. So there's a lot of things that you can get. I would recommend for a wildflower mix that the Plants of the Southwest has a really great one for our climate. And so you can go online and just order that online actually. So all sorts of great options to really like make your yard beautiful and give back to the environment. And so from there, I have just a little thing at 7:45. So I would like to be able to take questions now. I hope you guys are starting questions, but I can do one of these at least. And this is just to kind of think about, I can't talk with you all very well, but you can think about it in your head is, when you see something in your yard, what's going on with it and what does it need? And so I have kind of an example here. We have a plant, this is called Be a Plant Detective. And our first mystery is a raspberry plant. And it has the berry plant has minimal flowers and leaves look purplish. And so it's like asking, what's wrong? Why is it not blooming a lot? Why am I not going to get a lot of raspberries? My leaves have a weird tint to them. What's going on? And usually it's some sort of nutrient deficiency. So what is it? Would it be nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, trace minerals, watering too much? What is the problem? And so I'm not sure what everyone's thinking right now. I don't know if you can see that. Oops. But the answer is phosphorus. So you'd want to be able to go back and put phosphorus on your plants. So it can lead to little flower production and having that purple tint on your raspberries or any plant. Second one, tomato plant. Leaves are small and your stems are real thin, like they're just being kind of flimsy, and the plant is growing slowly and not thriving. And the question would be, what nutrient would help that plant? And your answer is nitrogen. So nitrogen is something that definitely improves the greenness and the like fullness of a plant. So nitrogen is definitely going to help things grow better. Pumpkin plant. Leaves have yellow edges and the pumpkins are small. So you're not getting nice fruit production. What's happening? What's the problem? And here we have potassium. So potassium is going to help with that. I would say that when you have yellow edges, it could also mean that you need nitrogen or it's being overwatered. So sometimes there's a mix of things happening, but there's definitely signs that will kind of help you lead to what's going on with your garden. So with that, I think, ending, it's just important to really think about what system you have going on. How are you building up that soil? How are you giving back to your soil? And how are you giving back to your plants so that you're continuing year after year to build up those nice nutrients in your soil? And I have some resources on here. This is a really great book for starting to think about permaculture. And thinking of your garden as an ecosystem rather than just as like a food production system. How does it work? What's all the pieces involved? That's permaculture. And then some other resources for drip irrigation and that kind of thing. And now we're on to questions. If anybody has any questions, I'd love to answer more. There's so many different topics.
Yes, we do have some questions. And if anybody else has any questions, please send those over in the chat and I can relay them to Denise. But to start off, Denise, how does using horse manure bring in weed seeds to your garden?
Oh, so yeah, it's a good question. And it is something that people are concerned about. So there's different ways to avoid it. If the manure has been composted really well, then it won't. So you can do two things. If you really want to be careful, you can compost it yourself. So if you get it from somebody else and you don't know what the horses have necessarily been eating, and if there's still seeds in there, you can put it through like the compost process of getting it real warm, real hot. And maybe if you have like some large bin, 3-tier bin compost systems, you can let it sit and age, and it really breaks down quite a bit. And I haven't had any problems with it. I have so much of it, like in a huge mass, that I don't have big enough compost bins to be able to compost that much. So theoretically, you could get some weed seeds in. I just haven't had a big problem with that. So I don't usually worry about it.
Awesome. All right, this viewer says, thank you for your suggestion to plant squash late June to avoid squash bugs. If we still get them, do you have any suggestions of what to do?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, squash bugs are like my nemesis. We had so much trouble with them the first year that I started growing squash out in Pajarito acres. And so it almost made me not want to grow squash. And then I tried that later in June and it worked. But I did put frost covers over my beds to try to block out, because I wanted to get the plants growing. And so I put kind of like a frost cover over until it started to bloom and I needed to take them off. So really it went into July that no bugs could get to them. Once you get the squash bugs, people have different ways that they can do them, but nothing is going to be like ideal. But most people say that you can pick them off, but if you know how squash grows, I was spending hours picking them off and you still can't get them all. You can do things like, they like to hide under stuff. So I would put out cardboard and wood boards, and they will, if it's moist under there and cool, they'll like congregate under there, so you can get a bunch of them. There's like different traps and things that people recommend online, but sprinkling diatomaceous earth doesn't work. You could put like an actual insecticide, but I don't generally like to spray that kind of stuff on my garden. And so it's really about prevention. Once you get them, you can try hand picking them if you have a small enough area, but that's really your best bet. And then if you do get them really bad, some people don't plant squash for a year or two to try and get some of those eggs out of there. But that's your best solution.
Thank you. How do you prepare soil for a bee and butterfly friendly perennial or wildflower garden? I have a large area I'd like to transform.
Yeah, so I'm actually doing a lot of wildflower planting right now. It depends on the types of wildflowers that you're trying to plant. So if you're doing native wildflowers that are going to grow with pretty low water, then you could do something like sprinkle a pretty thin layer of like nice compost down, and then sprinkle your seeds, you can get a binder, which you sprinkle over the top of it and add water, and it kind of holds those seeds down for the wind. And you can buy that at that same Plants of the Southwest with your wildflower seed mix. And so that you can use that in like larger areas, especially that are like a little more undeveloped. And so that's one option for just kind of broadcast spreading seeds. And then those seeds will reseed themselves over time, because not all of them are perennials. And then for like more of a bed type of area, doing that layered composting system is also what I'm going to do for like a long fence line I have. So I'm putting down cardboard, putting down manure, straw, leaves, and then putting a top layer of topsoil, like compost topsoil. And so you'll have kind of a nice area built up for them, and then you can sprinkle those seeds on there just as well. They'll just grow a little better in that kind of a condition, because you have a better soil developing. And then if you're watering that, everything's breaking down and really giving those plants like a nice place to grow. It's just that that's not always, depending on what you want to do. Like if it's a really big area, doing that layering composting can be too much. And that's why if you get those native wildflowers, they will just grow in our native soil. But to start them out, you're going to have to put some, like a thin layer, just a couple inches of topsoil down, and use a binder, and then water them by hand until they get going. And then once they get going and they've established some roots, then they should be okay.
Perfect.
Hopefully that helps. If there's any more follow-up, please go ahead and ask.
Are there any certain vegetable plants that shouldn't be planted next to each other?
Oh, that's the idea of companion planting. And you can look up like lists of companion planting plants. I don't actually pay that close attention to that. There are, but it's not, nothing that's going to be a huge problem. Maybe just more because of like logistics, like you're not going to want to plant lettuce probably right in between tomato plants, because it's going to be it's going to totally shade it out. So there's like areas, like ideas of like how a plant grows and how it's going to shade out something else. Usually I think of it more the opposite, and what to plant together because they benefit each other. And so that's a cool concept that has been being done for a long time. So there's like the idea of Three Sisters gardening here in New Mexico that was developed by Pueblo people and Native American, like Native people in the South America. Also, it's a very old ancient way of planting, where you're having corn stalks growing up, and then you're doing your beans growing up the corn stalks, and the beans are actually fixing the nitrogen for the soil also. And then you plant the corn stalks like separated out enough that you can put squash in between. And so it gives like all three foods that were really crucial for surviving. And then that squash also creates a kind of like a green mulch layer and holds in the moisture for the soil, because corn does take a lot of water. So you can really like work things together to help things. And then you can also plant things that will like attract a certain insect or deter a certain insect next to something else, and that's why people put certain flowers or herbs next to a certain plant that might get a lot of bugs. So there's that idea. But I wouldn't worry too much about things that can't be next to each other.
Gotcha. All right. And then what looks like our last question, is there anything you can do if you notice your soil seems to be becoming hydrophobic? Or is there a way to stop or prevent this, especially in potted or smaller beds?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I think what you're referring to is the idea of like really poor infiltration. And the water just won't go in. And that what's happened is the soil has become really compacted, And so it just doesn't have enough organic matter in it. It's all kind of broken down. And so you have like no soil structure. And so everything's just kind of collapsed into itself, and there's no space for the water to go. And so the only way to fix that is to you want to not, when nothing's planted, mix in a whole bunch of organic matter. So you're going to mix in a bunch of manure and leaves and straw, and get those soil microbes working again to create that nice environment where there's pores and nutrients are being released, and then you have the soil structure and space allowing the water to come through. If that makes sense. And that goes back to, I can go back to the slide if you want. See this idea, yeah, and then this one too. Oops. Where just you have like minimal water infiltrating down because there's no structure, there's no space for it. And that's why mixing in all that organic matter is so important with your soil.
Perfect. All right, well, that's all of our questions that came in from viewers. Thank you so much, Denise, for joining us and leading us in this evening. To everyone who joined us for tonight's talk, thank you. And remember to keep an eye on your email for the survey coming out, hopefully tomorrow. And in that survey, we'll include a copy of this presentation, so you'll have access to all those links and all this information to use years to come. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night.